This is Forensic Anthropology for Rise of Civilization, Part 3. We're going to talk about determining sex and determining ethnicity. So, how do we tell the sex of a person? In a perfect world, the males are always bigger than the females. If you look at this slide here, if everything were perfect, men's skulls would have a squarer jaw, they'd have a heavier brow ridge, they'd have larger canines, more muscle attachments, and the female skull would be very gracile or delicate, sharper orbits for the eyes, a rounder chin. But what you need to understand is, again, you can't go by this because there's so much variation in populations. I've seen women whose skulls look like the males in this picture, and I've seen men whose skulls look more like the female. So you have to be careful. But in general, this is one way to tell, or you'll look for some of these characteristics. One thing that you might not hear about when you do look to sex a skeleton is what's called the mastoid process. Again, this is a non-metric trait, but it could help you. That's that part of the bone that sticks out there of the skull. And again, in general, males should be bigger than females, but again, it depends on the person. Brow ridge. Once again, something you could look for. Now, the pelvis is always a good one. If you don't always have a pelvis, but if you have one, this is great. So there you see the female pelvis is A, which is always going to be wider. Why is it wider? Because, of course, females give birth. The males is always not as wide. Looking down into it, what they say is that it's much more oval in a female. In a male, it's more heart-shaped. To me, it looks kind of like Mickey Mouse ears. But again, the female pelvis is always going to be wider. Here's some other more obscure kind of traits you could look for. But just understand, we can tell. Sometimes you can tell by looking at the long bones. Here's one way of doing it. And then we can actually estimate stature. Now, this is where we run into a little bit of a problem too, because what do women always lie about on their driver's license? If you're like me, I fudge on my weight a little bit. What do men lie about? Well, men sometimes lie about how tall they are. So we have ways of looking at computer programs to help determine the stature of someone just based on some of the long bones we find. But it's kind of interesting because let's say our calculations say the person was 5'10", and on the driver's license of the person that we think it might be, it says they're 6 foot. Well, what do? You got to look for other traits. So there are a lot of statistical tables that were made. They actually used the data by looking at World War II dead, the soldiers who had died, because we had all the stats on them, so they knew how tall they were, and then they were able to measure their bones. So here's how the measurements are taken. Plug it in the computer, and here's all the statistical variations. Okay, we're not really going to get into race. I like to use the term ethnicity. And so basically, as you learned, there are no real true races anymore. But, by looking at some of these characteristics, it might give you some clues as to the person's background. And usually we're always looking at the skull. So, these are just for fun. It's really hard to tell race. And again, we do the best we can. This is what we use if we need clues, if we have no idea who the person is. So here you see in general skulls of the three main racial groups. You have white, Asian, and black. And here's a nice chart that'll kind of tell you in general what you're going to find. Differences in the eye orbits. Again, in a perfect world. Differences in the dental arcades. Now, what is interesting is if you look at B, where it says shovel-shaped in Asians, this is just one of many, many other things they looked at in helping to determine where the Native Americans of North and South America came from. So they looked at blood typing, they looked at a lot of language, a lot of other characteristics, but they also do have more of the distinct shovel-shaped teeth. And then you actually can see differences in the dental arcades, which is shown in figure 7.8. But again, you're not going to see this textbook stuff all the time. The mandibles. Okay, sometimes there's differences. And I'm not going to get into these, but this will just give you some idea of what people use. Here's these shovel incisors again. Wormian bones. Because these are real funky looking sutures, so this might give you a clue. Again, arcades, so for Caucasians, again, differences in eye orbits, metopic suture, the dental arcade.